Welcome everyone. My name is Joanna Salinas and I am the Outreach Coordinator with the Waukesha County Green Team. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with us, we are a volunteer-based nonprofit organization focused on promoting environmental and economic sustainability in Waukesha County. And we do that through education, collaboration, and local action. And if you are joining us from around the country or even internationally, which is wonderful due to the power of Zoom, Waukesha, Wisconsin is located in the southeast corner of Wisconsin, which is sort of right in the northern center of the United States. We are excited you are with us tonight. So we're excited to gather all of you here for this presentation this evening by our permaculture and gardening group. So our P&G group is made up of residents of Waukesha County who enjoy gardening and learning more about how we can incorporate permaculture ideas into our landscape and gardens and homes. So tonight we are excited to welcome back Jim Stute, crop and soil expert, and Jim will tell us all about himself in just a minute. But just for logistics for tonight, we're going to ask everybody to stay muted for right now. And as Jim is presenting, feel free to type your questions right into the chat as you think of them, because there will be opportunities for us to stop and to have Jim answer those questions. So, all right, thank you all for joining us and welcome, Jim.
Well, thanks for having me. Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I wish it was in person because talking to the green team is by far the best talk of the year, especially when you're talking about soil. So anyway, that's the cards we were dealt, so we will deal with them. An apology up front. When I painted my office this burnt orange color several years ago, I was not thinking about the Zoom era. And the other thing, I got a blanket covering the west facing window behind me to cut down on the glare. I will have to put my glasses on so they will glare, but I'll try to keep them off a little bit. Anyway, next time I go through these iterations, I will think about Zoom, because I think we're going to be doing more business there. So Joanna introduced me a little bit. Last time I talked with the group, I was the research director at the Microflora Institute. We've moved on from there. So what I do professionally, and I'm proudest to say that I am a farmer. It's been a lifelong goal of mine to farm just with economics. It wasn't possible. This is my 27th consecutive year of farming on the farm here. It's my family farm. My dad grew up on this farm. I farmed a little bit in the mid 80s and flunked out, so I went to graduate school. And then we moved down here and started farming. And then I've had professional employment both at the Institute and also with UW Extension. So I'm going to work that into my slides a little bit. Professionally, what I do other than farming, it's still, it doesn't pay all the bills. So I'm an independent researcher. So I've got several projects that are related research projects scattered around southeast Wisconsin, looking at cover crops. And I'll talk a lot about soil health tonight, but I'm really focused on the economic component of all the conservation practices that I work with as a hook to get conventional farmers to use them. You know, farmers, they buy into soil health, but you got to make money farming. And so what I'm out trying to demonstrate is the financial feasibility. So that's what I'm doing professionally, as well as working with the Watershed Protection Group. So this is a recent phenomenon in the state of Wisconsin. We've got, with the last grant round, I think we're over 30 groups that have sprung up around the state. There are several that are active or forming here in southeast Wisconsin, and I am a member of the Racine County group, the Watershed Protection Committee of Racine County, which is one of the original groups. It's one of the largest and the most active groups in the state. And the reason for joining them is we can't seem to get one going. I tried last year to get one going in my watershed, Aquanico River, and couldn't do it. And same thing with broader Walworth County. And so we all joined that group. It's interesting, it's a Racine County group, but there's farmers from Kenosha, Jefferson, Walworth, and I think we got a token farmer from Milwaukee County in that group. So that's in a nutshell what I'm doing professionally. So we're going to talk about building great soil. So we're going to review some basic soils concepts just to set the stage for the fun part of tonight, and that's doing it right. And in case we haven't done it right and we're dealing with some problems, we'll talk about how to deal with the problems and some steps you can take to remediate them. And again, so in a way, presenting by Zoom is really easy. I'm not all nervous because I know it's being recorded and there's 176 people out there. But at the same time, I can't judge audience participation. If you're laughing at my jokes, I'll get that. But not knowing if you got questions, and I can kind of see if there's questions in the chat box, I will stop periodically and we'll cover anything. And that makes it a little nerve-wracking because you don't know if you've blown something and people are totally confused. And so I don't want that to happen. So Joanna's going to watch the chat box, and if there's something, she will interrupt me. So that's kind of the way we worked it out. Before we jump into it, technical problems are also nerve-wracking because on my old IT department, I cannot advance. There we go. Just a few promotions right up front. So I said I'm not at the Michael Fields Institute anymore, but I wanted to bring this up because of a development. So people that haven't heard me talk before, the Michael Fields Institute is a nonprofit that's worked in the area of sustainable agriculture since 1984. They're located in East Troy. That's where the main campus is, and that's where the research and demonstration farms are, but they also have staff and a growing staff in Madison working on policy. And it'd be worth, if you're not familiar with them, going to their websites. The link's down at the bottom. I bring that up in the context of the Green Team because they have grant advising service. So they've got somebody on staff who, if you've got a project you'd like to get grant funding for, they can help you with that. And they're tied into especially on the federal side, federal resources for some project you may have. So I bring that up because that's a service that they offer. But then a partial replacement of mine. So I don't know how to look at this, but two of us left at approximately the same time. One was the education director, I was the research director. They combine those two positions into one. They call that position the agroecologist. And that's Dr. Nicole Tauges. And she is really interested in what I'm doing tonight. She's really interested in gardening and just green landscapes from an agroecological standpoint. And so I told her that I would put her contact information up there. I really didn't do that, but you can find her at the Michael Fields link. So and she also recognizes that with the downsizing extension that's happened over the past several years, that there's definitely a need out there. So she is available for future talks. Not that I'm trying to give this gig away, but she is available and would probably bring a slightly different slant other than the straight soils like that I bring. But so that's something to the group, but she's also available for other things related to horticultural education. Now that I have to work, I can't figure out which direction to go. UW Extension, the publication website has not missed a beat, and there's a lot of new publications that get posted quite frequently. And so I'm going to allude to this publication, Cover Crops for the Home Garden. So I did a search when I was putting the slides set together of just cover crops, and there was a bunch of new titles in there that I'm excited to learn about, and I'll be looking at them sometime in the near future. As with most of the extension publications, you can download them for free as a PDF. So the site's down there. If you don't get a chance to write it down, just Google the Learning Store, and it'll take you right to it. The next promotion is Rock River Lab. So full disclosure, I have a casual gig with them. I run the soil sampler here. I bring them up because they're a local company. They're located in Watertown, and they conveniently have a homeowner garden package for sampling of your soils. So if you request that, they'll mail it to you. It's got the information sheet, the soil sample bags. I don't think the extension offices give out the bags anymore like they used to. The other thing to say is that they're local in Watertown. The UW Extension Lab moved everything up to Marshfield, so it's not as convenient for delivering your samples if you want to do it in person. So I just bring that up. And the sample ring, I'm going to bring that up when I talk about something in just a minute. The next thing I want to promote is Kokoroz. So I'm sure many of you are volunteers for the Kokoroz Network. So Kokoroz stands for Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. So it's a citizen science effort where reporters have the official Kokoroz gauge. This is mine here at home. I've been an official reporter for 8 months now, and I report my daily precipitation as well as snowfall to their website, and I do it as part of a community service. The reason I bring this up, other than the fact it's just fun, I really like doing it, and especially I like reporting on their web form. So that's what I'm circling here. So this is what I fill out on a daily basis. As soon as I hit submit, I get a summary of precipitation across the that is not my dog, across the United States. And let me tell you, when we report at 6 in the morning, there's not this many reports filed, but it's just interesting to see where the precipitation is. So I bring it up because it's a fun thing to do and it contributes. So they tell you, like people at the National Weather Service, hey, we use your data, especially the snowfall data, to help us predict based on current forecasts, what's the potential for river flooding, that kind of thing. I actually use this. You can access the data, and I use it in a water quality monitoring effort I did last summer in Mukwonago River to measure base flow. And so I had to demonstrate that I didn't have any current precipitation, current being the last couple of weeks, that would influence the results that I got. So I was measuring what was in base flow, which means it comes from groundwater. And so it's independent scientists like me and other research projects that use this. So this is a valuable thing to the research community. And I bring it up because Kokoroz had a fundraising drive, but that ended. It ended with March. They called it March Madness, and Wisconsin didn't win. Although Wisconsin was pretty high. So there's a lot of new reporting sites in the state. Now time to US Drought Monitor. So this is from last week, and actually things have improved a little bit. But from a soil management standpoint, as a farmer, I am really scared at what's going on out there. We're having an earlier spring. It's really early. I was able to fill one of the buckets on my bucket list, and that was planting oats in March. So Nicole and I planted oats for a trial she's got on my farm last Tuesday, and the dust was flying, and that's kind of scary. And so we're seeing drought to the west of us. We've been abnormally dry. You see Wisconsin, we've been classified as abnormally dry for about a week. But if we don't start getting rain, I'm really concerned about what we're going to see this growing season. So we were dry last year, and I would have called our local vicinity here of southeast Wisconsin in a drought, at least up to the Fox River. Beyond there, they seem to be getting rain that we didn't get in Walworth and Waukesha and Jefferson counties, but we're setting up, we don't have a lot of moisture in the subsoil. So this is a little bit disconcerting to me. So think about that as you're managing your soils. Speaking of soils, let's jump into it. I do have to present a little bit of a warning though to the group. Again, I can't see who's in the audience, but given the type of material that we're going to present here, I think this is appropriate.
They are all collectively laughing. You just can't hear it because I muted them.
I know, but I can feel the love. I totally forgot I found that I presented to a group of Carroll College students, and they didn't get it. It's like, well, in a couple of years when you got kids of your own, then you'll get it. All right, so let's talk about soils. And the reason for the focus on healthy soils is the equation. Without healthy soil, you cannot have healthy plants. So soil as a system is really complex. And in our review here, we're going to talk about the complexity and how interrelated the system is. And let's couple that with the fact, and it's true, gardening is really hard on soil. So you think about it, you got a garden, you've got season-long foot traffic because you got to go out there, you got to prepare the soil, but then you got to plant the rows, you got to weed the rows, and we'll talk about foot paths later on in the talk. You got to control the pests, you got to harvest. So there's a lot of season-long traffic causing compaction. The second thing is that we have a prolonged period. I'll show you a picture of this, of bare soil in the garden. A lot of our horticultural crops are really slow to develop. And so the soil is bare and prone to the problems of raindrop impact. So that's really hard on the soil. It creates crusting, it creates compaction. So that's something we need to think about in our management. Frequent tillage, for whatever reason, we tend to till more in horticultural production, and a lot of it has to relate to weed control that destroys the soil structure. And then if we're practicing good sanitation to prevent diseases, we got to remove those plant residues that protect the soil surface from the raindrops, from foot traffic. That removal of the residue takes away nutrients, it takes away potential organic matter, and that's the food source for the biological activity. So we need to think about that and manage our soils for soil health, knowing that we're going to be removing a lot of the residue. Oh, I forgot harvest too. I mean, you're harvesting mostly vegetative portions of plants, so that's residue that the soil microbes can't feed on. So managing soils for healthy soil, it's actually really simple if you think about it, and think about it as a three-legged stool. So there's three key components to soil health: soil structure, soil organic matter, and the biological activity. And like I said, all are interrelated and they function together. So here's a quiz. Does soil quality equal soil health? So if this was live, I would have said, hey, someone get a case of beer and we can talk. Well, it's a big group, get a couple of cases of beer and we'll talk about this all night. So I'll just tell you, no. They both imply quality. And these terms used to be used interchangeably. Quality relates to the physical properties of the soil, but it totally ignores the health. When you talk about the health, we're talking about the life within the soil, whether it's the microorganisms or the macroinvertebrates. That's the health part. So I'm going to stick with health. You can't have good soil health without good soil quality, which means physical properties. But the polls are still open. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn it off. But health implies the entire system, physical and biological. So now we're going to talk about these components of the three components, and we'll start with soil structure. So soil structure is nothing more than the aggregation of primary particles. So the primary soil particles, just to review, the sand, the clay, and the silt. So it's the aggregation or the gluing together of these individual particles into compound particles or clusters. So this is what we call aggregates. So why is this so important? Because it modifies the influence of texture in regard to, and this basically gets to pore space, moisture and air relationships, the availability of plant nutrients, the action of microorganisms, and its root growth. So what this does is change texture. Inherently in each of those primary particles, the sand, the silt, and the clay, there's some inherent problems with them. And it's all based on their size, nothing to do with their chemical properties. So sand are the largest particles. You get a bunch of sand particles together, there's a lot of pore space through there. What does that mean? Moisture moves right through it. Clay or silt is intermediate. Clay is on the other extreme, a lot of really tiny particles, and nothing can move through it because they're all packed together, and so there's no pore space in between them. So you glue the sand, the silt, and the clay together, and all of a sudden it changes the amount of pore space and the range of pore sizes, and that creates the magic that comes with the soil aggregate. So here's what it looks like. An ideal soil from a plant standpoint, not from an engineering standpoint. An engineering standpoint, it would be all mineral. There'd be no pore space here. But from a plant standpoint, half of the soil is solid material. Most of that solid material is going to be the ground up minerals that form the background or the lattice of the soil. So that's the sand, the silt, and the clay particles. And then this diagram is really optimistic. 5% organic matter, no, more, it's like more 2 to 3% if we're lucky, depending where you are in southeast Wisconsin, but that's still the solid material. So that's the solid 50%. And then 50% is pore space. So half of that is going to be filled with water. This is the water that the plants need to take up with their roots to support their function. And then 25% of the total volume is going to be pore space that has air in it. And that's really important for gas exchange, to get the oxygen down into the roots and then to get the carbon dioxide out of the root zone. So this is what it looks like as a pie graph, but life doesn't look like a pie. It looks more like this, and this is still cartoonish, but here you see the system. So we've got the soil particles. The large one are the clay particles or the sand particles. The really small ones that you can't see are the clay particles here. And then the silt, which is intermediate. So within the pore spaces between the particles, that's where the bacteria are, that's where the fungi are. This is where we have the airspace. So we have moisture moving in, or not moisture, air moving in. I got excited, a tractor drove by. I'm a farmer, excitable, springtime. And then on the outside of the particles is where the water clings, and this is what the roots are going to draw out. And then the one I'm forgetting here is the fungi. So it's all mixed up, and this is kind of on the inside of the aggregate. So what does it look like? This is what they look like diagrammatically. So this is an aggregate here. We've got all those particles glued together. So there's really tiny pore spaces in there that hold the moisture that the roots can draw on. And then in between the particles, I should say the bacteria and the fungi, they're also inside the aggregates. And then in between, we have very large pore spaces. And that's what allows for the gas exchange to enter the system and also excess moisture to drain away. So this is what it looks like as a cartoon. This is what it looks like in reality. This is a really well aggregated soil, and you can see the range, or you can imagine based on the range and particle sizes, the different pore size and their distribution. This is important because it really affects plant growth. and it affects the roots, but anything that affects the rate of growth of the roots also impacts the above ground growth, what we actually see. So on the left here is a well aggregated soil, and you can see the roots have grown through it. They've gotten into the subsoil. It's starting to get dry. This is where the moisture is going to be. They've grown down into it, and so they're going to be able to get moisture. In the soil with a really poor aggregation, we have a crust on the top, and that's bad because that keeps the gas exchange from happening, from the oxygen moving in and the carbon dioxide from the roots going out. And germinating seeds, so on the diagram it shows a germinating seed. I can't really see it without my glasses on. Seeds need moisture to germinate, and they also need air, and if they don't have air, they're not going to germinate. So it's tightly packed together, and we also have larger blocks with fewer cracks. So this is a compaction zone. We got subsurface compaction below it. The roots you see compared right to left, the roots are much smaller, and so the above ground portion is much smaller also. So aggregates, they are always forming and they are always breaking down. This is a natural phenomenon. We as managers, it's our goal to favor this balance to the formation side and discourage the breakdown. On the formation side, aggregates form anytime we have organic matter decomposition. So these are the residues that we're adding back to the soil. So the soil fungi and the soil bacteria, they break those down. Their waste products glue the sand, silt, and clay together to form the aggregate. The microbial gums, that's a polysaccharide that's water soluble, and so it'll glue it together. But anytime those aggregates wet up, that glue comes apart and the aggregates fall apart back into the sand, the silt, and the clay. The glomalin is from the fungi, and this is the magic of the microbial glue world, because glomalin is water insoluble, and so the particles, the aggregates that form with the help of glomalin, stick together when it wets. The other thing that causes the formation is soil physical chemical interactions with colloids. Colloid is a fancy way to say clay. Anytime the soil dries out, the water leaving the system through evaporation, and this is kind of complicated physics, but the particles get pulled together as that water stream leaves, and then they grab a hold of each other, and voila, we have an aggregate. Destruction, we've talked about the wetting, so anytime the soil wets up, they come apart. Tillage or mechanical disruption, so you think about tillage, that's steel on soil violence. So physically, it just breaks it apart. And then mechanical disruption, something as simple as us walking on the soil surface will disrupt the aggregates. And if it's really severe, it's compaction. So compaction is the pushing of the aggregates together and eliminating pore space. Compaction is really what we want to think about when we're managing soil physically to prevent it. And the reason compaction is so bad is because it reduces pore space. And so that directly affects infiltration. With the reduction of pore space, we have a reduction in drainage. So the infiltration, that's water entering the soil. Drainage is water moving through the soil, the free water that the soil can't hold, and would drain away freely to allow for gas exchange. And because of this, the gas exchange and the moisture, it also influences the soil microbes and their activity. So when we get a compacted soil, microbial activity is reduced, and so the magic they work on the soil properties also gets reduced. Compaction also reduces nutrient availability. I'll show you a picture of this in a minute. And it may also physically damage roots. So in the garden, this is maybe not necessarily that big a deal, especially if you've got established footpaths. The plants are going to detect that soil is compacted when they're growing out laterally, so they're going to stay away from it. But I'm thinking more about the case of landscaping and your lawns. So after tonight, you're going to say, hey, it's too wet to garden. Jim said to stay off of wet soil. And I hope that comes with the rain that's in the forecast. So what do you do when you can't go in the garden? You mow your lawn. Well, think about it. You're on your rider, you're underneath trees, you're riding on the lawn, you're compacting that soil, which is bad. But if your mower's heavy enough and the soil is wet enough that it's going to cause major compaction, you may physically damage the roots. And the compromised root, so I'm thinking about the sheath that's on the outside of the root, if you tear that, then all of a sudden you've got an entry point for pathogens. And the money, those really expensive trophy landscape plants that you have suddenly are now susceptible to these pathogens. And the other thing to say is that two of our worst actors, the Pythium and the Phytophthora, they excel in low oxygen environments. What's a low oxygen environment? Something that's saturated with water or something that's been compacted. So we can't have gas exchange. Compaction, not good. So here's a diagram of it, kind of like what I saw with growing plants. So in the loose, uncompacted soil, here on the left, the root's able to grow through it easily. There's not restriction to the growth, and oxygen can enter the system and carbon dioxide can leave it. And if you have a compacted soil, that carbon dioxide can build up to the point that it's toxic to the plant. And here you see the oxygen's being excluded, so I can't get to it. I can not remember if I showed this to you last time. So what this is a latex cast of two different soils. The one on the left is not compacted. The one on the right is compacted. First day, my windows have been open and people are pulling in and out of my driveway. That's got me distracted, and I don't have a door in my office to close it, so sorry about that. So on the left, uncompacted soil, what the latex did, it was injected under pressure and it followed the old root channels down to the bottom where they were taking the casting. And so you see we've got a lot of nice root channels there. Great for gas exchange, great for moisture moving into the profile, great for the next root to come along, great for the earthworms because they don't have to burrow themselves, especially the night crawlers. Here on the right, we have a definite compacted zone. So a few of the roots made it through the compacted zone. You can't really tell it, but they tried to move, the roots tried to move laterally, and that's how we ended up with a bunch of root mass all bunched up because it had nowhere to go, and they got to keep trying to find a place to grow. So that's what explains the roots being confined up here. Soil dries out, that's a problem. They can't get through it. They can't chase the water down, and the plants definitely are not going to do well. So this is showing layer compaction that comes from tillage. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Moisture plays a huge role in compaction. I have never addressed this in this talk before. So we've talked about the moisture test. So how do you know your soil's too wet to work? You go out, you go down to the depth, you dig down to the depth that you want to dig or do whatever operation. You bring up a handful of soil, you ball it up with some light pressure and then try to tease it apart. And if it crumbles, you know you're good to go. What about down below? You're not going to work that. Is it okay to work it? Well, maybe not, because the soil moisture may be at a sufficient soil moisture level that's going to cause compaction. So down on the bottom on the x-axis, we have soil moisture increasing as we move right, and then compaction on the y-axis, degree of compaction increasing as we go up. The amount of compaction for a given force is determined by the soil moisture, and it will increase as soil moisture goes up to the point of maximum compaction, and then beyond that, it starts to decline. Why is that? Because you cannot compress or compact moisture. That's how hydraulics work. So you can go out on soil totally saturated soils, you will do no damage because the moisture, well, you'll do some, but not much, because the moisture that's there can't be compressed, and so that will support the weight to a point. Before this, and we want to stay away from this, before this, we're still seeing some compaction. This is the area you want to be in where we're not getting any compaction, but as moisture increases to a point, you get compaction. Some of the management that I'm going to talk about, especially footpaths and that kind of thing, is to deal with moisture when we get more into this range. But definitely here, you want to stay off, and even though compaction's falling off, you probably want to stay off your soil then. So I talk about compaction limiting nutrient availability. So this is kind of an exaggeration. This comes out of a slide out of Master Gardener training. But what it shows is a soil aggregate and the exchange sites on the outside of the aggregate. So the clay particles that make up this aggregate, they have a negative charge. Most of the nutrients that we're interested in from a plant nutrition standpoint are positively charged. So they are naturally drawn to the negative exchange sites, and then they sit there and then wait for the plant root to pull them off. And then they get replaced by other nutrients that are in solution, and so they're held there. What happens with compaction is all this gets pushed together. So this entire surface is now covered, and any of these nutrients, and in particular potassium. So in function, potassium would be on most of these exchange sites. That gets trapped between those soil particles, and now the plants cannot draw them out with the stream, the tension stream that the roots are exerting to draw nutrients to them. So that's how potassium gets tied up with compaction. All right. So let's stop there because I'm going to switch to organic matter. Any pressing questions, Joanna?
Yeah, we have two on compacted soil. The first is, aren't there plants that have deep roots that can help break up the compacted soil?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's called biotillage. So anything that's got a really big taproot. So radishes come to mind because there's a proprietary variety called tillage radish, and the farmers are using them for biotillage. So anything that's got a big taproot is going to go deeper into the soil, and so that'll break up more of the. So if you look at the soil, this is the profile, and so down in the subsoil, that's Joanna sitting there. So that root is going to go through that and break up the plow pan, the layer compaction, and get to the moisture that's down below, and some nutrients. Some nutrients will be below. Fibrous rooted crops, so this is more the grass type species, they're going to stay up here in the topsoil and break up any tightening of the soil particles that are up there. And especially when we talk about cover cropping, to remediate compaction, you got to think about the kind of compaction that you have, and then target your cover crop species and their root architecture for breaking up that compaction. Great question. The other one?
Yeah, the second question, and you've touched on it a little bit, is, can soil uncompact over time?
Can soil uncompact? Yes. We didn't have it this year. That's the freeze thaw cycle. So in my farmer clients, the ones who use tillage, which are very few because I hang out with the happen to no tillers, people always used to say they do their plowing in the fall and it'd be a little too wet, and they'd say they'd know they were making clods, they were compacting their soil, and they'd always say, hey, with the freeze thaw cycles, that'll go away. And to a certain extent, that is true, but you got to have the freeze thaw cycles for that to happen. And what happens is that water freezes and it breaks the clod apart. We didn't have that at all this year. We did get a little bit of soil freezing, but as soon as we got that snow cover, even with the cold temperatures we had, we didn't get much freezing. Asked the guy that plows for the town on my road who ripped up my lawn. There was a lot of snow out there, but the frost went out. So you will get some natural, but don't count on it. So like everything, avoidance is the best management. Any other topics for the
That
minute?
was it. You can move on. Thanks.
All right, so the next leg of the soil health stool is soil organic matter. So organic matter is anything in the soil that contains carbon, and I actually modified this in my notes. Organic carbon. So there is organic carbon, inorganic carbon in soils, that's carbonate, and we've got a fair amount of that in portions of Waukesha County. So that's the limestone, so calcium and magnesium carbonate. So when we're talking about organic matter, it's organic carbon. So this is anything that's been living. So it can be currently living. So there's a lot of organic carbon tied up in microbial biomass. So that's the cells of the bacteria and the fungi. It can be living, it can be recently dead. So it could be dead cells, it could be dead plants, or it could be long time dead. So this is the stable organic matter, what we call the humus. So there's several forms or pools in the soil. I'm gonna, from a functional standpoint, just talk about two of them. The stable organic matter, this is what we call humus. This is the long-term dead. I've told you the story before. I had a colleague at Extension who did his Ph.D. characterizing the stable organic matter in the soils of Iowa. And he found on average, using carbon dating, that the humus that's in soils in the state of Iowa is on the order of 700 to 800 years old. So it's been around for a long time. So its function is nutrient storage. So most of the goodness has been plucked off. The bacteria, the fungi, or whatever else could have fed on it have done that. They've taken almost everything that they can get at. And so what that leaves is a lot of negatively charged exchange sites. So it functions just like the clay. It holds on to the nutrients that we apply, but it doesn't hold it so tightly. It holds it tightly enough that they can't leach away with water that's moving through the soil profile with recharge to the groundwater. But it doesn't hold it tight enough to keep plants from being able to draw them off when they're drawing water out of solution for transpiration. It acts like just like a sponge. So it wets up when the profile wets up, and it holds that moisture like a sponge does, and then the plants can draw on that with transpiration. So what this gives us is stable release of nutrients. So it's a very important source of nitrogen, phosphorus, and also sulfur. The other pool is the active organic matter. So this is the substrate for biological activity. This is what the bacteria, this is what the fungi feed on, and they use this active organic matter as a substrate for their energy, and then in exchange, they build up the soil aggregate. So this is really important. It's also important in nutrient cycling. So you think about it, there's dead plant material there. Those plants took up plant available nutrients. They are now in an organic form. The bacteria break down the organic form, put it back into plant available mineral form, and this is what's called nutrient cycling. So now those nutrients have been released in plant available form. What a great system. And then again, soil aggregation to their waste product, the microbial gums. So plant materials are really complex, and depending on the age of the plant material that's going back in, and species, broadleaf versus grasses, you're going to have a mix of different constituents in that organic material. So on the schematic here, it's showing green. So this is like a cover crop. This is like the greenest of the green that we can add to the system. There's going to be a lot of sugars, cellulose, and proteins, and somewhat hemicellulose. So this is getting more into structural components of the plant. These are all rapidly fermentable or decomposable, And so the soil life is going to get a hold of these. They're going to break them down rapidly, get the energy from them, and release plant available nutrients in the solution. As they chew on them, the other things that make up plant material, so the lignin, the polyphenols, these are slower to break down. They're really important for soil physical properties and also for the long-term storage. As they break down, they become the humus. And the humus is the dark colored stuff that gives soil its color. And here's a soil fun fact. You can tell the organic matter level without a soil test from Rock River Labs just by looking at the color. The darker the soil, the more organic matter that's there. That organic matter is in the form of humus. All right, we're going to talk about organic sources later on. Let's talk about soil biology, the third leg of the stool. So there's several different groups that are out there, the microflora to the fauna, or microfauna, I should say. So the micro are the microorganisms. From a soil health standpoint, this is what we're really interested in, the bacteria and the fungi. They're the ones that break down the plant material to glue the particles together. The others, the mesofauna and the fauna, they're more important from a physical standpoint to mix the soil up. So we tend to see a concentration of nutrients like with the fauna, the earthworms. So when they do their excretion and their secretion, it tends to be along the channels that they form, their earthworm holes. And so the other things like the mites and the springtails, they take that concentration of nutrients and they put it back out into the soil solution. So mixing is really important, and that includes mixing of coarse organic matter with soil particles to bring it into more intimate contact with the microorganisms. Because you think about it, soil's a big thing, and these things are microscopic. That's what they call microfauna. And so it's not like they can pack up and move to the that tasty piece of green organic material over there. They got to have something moving that stuff around to bring them into intimate contact. So in a meter of soil, and you probably can't see this because the Hollywood Squares is here on the right, but this is the order of magnitude of who's who in the zoo. So the bacteria and the fungi, they make up most of the organisms that are in the soil profile, and then in decreasing size, increasing size and decreasing number as you go up the pyramid. Together, they make the functioning soil decomposition, the nutrient cycling, and concentrating, and then the soil mixing. Soil organisms are important in every aspect of a functioning, healthy soil. So they themselves contribute organic matter in the form of their dead cells that cause the decomposition of plant cells and plant tissues, which lead to nutrient cycling. They're actually important in nitrate leaching. Nitrate leaching is not a good thing. So we as gardeners and we as farmers apply forms of nitrogen that don't have nitrate or have nitrate as a component, but it's not a major component, that are stable in the soil, but it's an energy source. And so there are certain bacteria in the soil that capture that energy and in the process convert ammonium nitrate to nitrate, which has a negative charge. So the soil aggregates and the exchange sites can't grab a hold of it. Nitrate is really soluble. So if you have water moving through the profile to recharge the groundwater, it takes the nitrate with it. It's the soil bacteria that actually make that conversion. And so you will read somewhere stabilized nitrogen. That's really an antibiotic that targets the specific species of bacteria that make this conversion so that that doesn't happen. If you have a deep-rooted crop, you should be able to, during the growing season, capture the nitrate that's leaching. If you don't have a deep-rooted crop, and most vegetable crops are not deep rooted. This is where cover crops come in. They come in, they back clean up in the fall of the year. They will chase that nitrate down, capture it, bring it back from deep down in the Joanna zone, bring it back up into the topsoil where it can be plant available for next year's growth. And the rest of them we have talked about. Lost in a lot of presentations and a lot of texts are the interactions that plants have and their contribution to the whole system. So plants actually exude compounds, they exude carbon, energy compounds into the system, and that's to stimulate biological activity so that the bacteria have something to feed on, so that they can also break down the more recalcitrant compounds to release the nitrogen that the plant conveniently then takes up. So it's a priming, self-serving system, but so that the plant themselves actually contribute to soil health with their root exudates. And that's shown on two of these schematics that I just plucked off the internet. And while I was doing that, I was listening to public radio and they were talking about proprietary right. And so I'm going to move on before someone recognizes their schematic. One of the great things about soil and a healthy soil is it is a free-for-all. You build up the decomposer populations, you build up the fungi that naturally break things down, and suddenly in this free-for-all, they're looking for stuff to attack. And because you've created this kind of environment, it creates what we call a disease suppressive soil. So our really bad actors from a disease standpoint, Pythium, Phytophthora, and there's a whole bunch of others, Rhizoctonia, they are not good generalists like the decomposers are. They're very specific. They have evolved to be pathogens. So they're looking for certain conditions, and they need certain conditions to survive in the soil if they don't have an acceptable host. And so by having this very active, healthy soil, we can affect pathogen survival and their ability to establish infections in the crops that we're growing. So this is a very active area of study, and we don't fully understand it now, but there's several suggested mechanisms. Some of these have been worked out. So just the competition for resources, you throw something in there and the generalists are going to decompose it, and they're not going to leave an area for the pathogens to survive. It could be a direct antagonism. So this is pathogen on or microbe on microbe warfare. It could be interference with the infection. So like I said, the plants are exuding these compounds, the carbon containing compounds. That creates a perfect spot for them to aggregate around the growing root. And so they're going to, by their physical interference, interfere with the potential to establish the infection because they're already there. And it could be that the bacteria stimulate or resistance response within the plant through some kind of chemical signaling that we don't really fully understand. And so in response to the microbes being around it, the plants may put out hormones or defense proteins that prevent the infection from happening in the first place. This happens both in bulk soil, but also the rhizosphere. So the rhizosphere is the area around the plant where the plant has an influence. It requires diversity and abundance. So the more you feed, so this is a diversity of species as well as sheer numbers. And to trigger this response, it's been suggested that compost is a source of inoculant. So I am a fan of compost. We'll talk about that later. So if you're putting soil in there, that may be a source of different species than you would have naturally occurring. And also it's a food source. So that's going to help with the abundance. Carbon inputs also really important to maintain this competitive environment so that the good actors can suppress the bad actors. And mycorrhizal fungi are also have been suggested as being important because they can interfere with the establishment of the infection. To get pathogen infection, they have to establish a intimate contact with the root. And if the mycorrhizae are already there and have established that relationship, then that reduces the chances for an infection because the sites just simply aren't there. So mycorrhizal are really important. This is where tillage is really bad. I'm going to talk about tillage in a bit. Tillage has a negative impact on the fungi that produce the mycorrhizal association, that produce the glomalin, because it destroys their fungal or their hyphal network. So that's something we need to be thinking about as we're managing our soils. The other thing to say is that several cover crop species promote fungi and spore production. So if you're disrupting the mycorrhizal networks with tillage, cover crops is a way to nurse it back into health. So I'm almost to the halfway point. I've used up 2/3 of my time. That's not a good sign. I'm available to stick around afterwards if people are willing, and I hope that's the case. There are a lot of tests that are out there to look at soil health, to try to quantify it. I like to look at qualitative tests. I was at a watershed meeting and they were talking about the Haney tests, and this is great. And they're like, Jim, do you use tests? And I was like, no. Soil health, it's like the definition of pornography. I know it when I see it. It's hard to define, and a burst test or whatever, no. How do I know when I'm planting, I can close my seed slots, I'm not seeing the wheel tracks. When I get off the tractor and I fondle the soil, that the crumbs are there. If it's like a clod, it'll break it apart, but I still have the aggregates. It's something that you intuitively know. You know it by the earthworms that are out there. You know by the color of the soil. It's got a darker color because there's more organic matter there. You dig roots during the season. You see they're not growing down and then to the side because they've hit a compacted zone. They're growing straight down into the Joanna zone. There's no subsurface compaction. You pick it up, you tease it with your hands, it breaks apart. That's the soil tilth. I don't see erosion in my fields. I forgot to put this slide in, this photograph in. Even though something looks healthy, if you see erosion, you know you've got a problem. It's either crusting on the surface or so the water can't infiltrate, or it just can't, you can't take in all the water that's there with the intense storms we're getting. And so erosion, if you see that, you got a problem. The smell, you all know that nice earthy smell. You don't need a test to tell you that. The water holding capacity. How does my garden hold up when it gets dry? Do I have to water it? If you have to water a lot, you know you've got a problem with water holding capacity, and that goes right back to soil health. Drainage, when we get a 5-inch rainfall, is it running off or do I have infiltration? Just a general plant. You look at your plants and they'll tell you if they're happy or not. Soil pH, that's another one. That's a chemical test. You will get that in your soil test. And that's related also to nutrient holding capacity. Do my plants show symptoms of deficiency with or without fertilizer? Am I putting a lot of nutrients on, but they're still showing nutrient deficiencies? All these things that you can see by looking at your garden will tell you if you've got a healthy soil or not. All right, soil fertility, I'm just gonna touch on this a little bit. 2 slides. Why? Because behind me is my dissertation. The whole thing's on soil fertility. It's a no-brainer. I'm telling you that right now. It's all in soil physical properties and biology. That being said, soil fertility, test your soil every 3 or 4 years just to know if you have something you need to correct. The biggest thing I'm thinking you're going to have to correct is pH. So Waukesha County is really unique for those of you joining on the interweb. I don't know where you're coming from, but Waukesha County up in the northeast corner, it's sitting on dolomitic limestone. So high pH is a soil problem. For those of us that are in the Kettle Moraine and the most of the county, we're sitting on ground up granite that the glacier dumped on top of the dolomitic bedrock. So we have to worry about soil pH being too low, and we can address that easily by putting lime on. But adjust your pH following your recommendations, make corrective applications if your soil test tells you that you're really low in phosphorus or potassium, but chances are that's not going to be the case. And except for nitrogen, you probably don't really need to worry about fertility in the home garden, or well, let's just say the home garden, because the organic material that you're going to add for soil physical reasons are going to be more than enough to supply the nutrients that you need. If you're pushing for production, like you're actually in horticultural production, then yeah, follow UW extension recommendations, which you'll get from your soil test, even if you send your soil test to Rock River Lab. And then the last thing to say is, if you're applying nutrients, watch nitrogen and phosphorus applications for the little dance they do. Green growing plants, the plants that you're growing for vegetative parts, so the leafy greens, they are high on nitrogen. So think about nitrogen in their case. But anything that flowers or has seed or a vegetative, not vegetative, but a reproductive part that you eat, there you don't want to overapply nitrogen, because that prevents flowering, and you want the floral part or the fruit as the harvested portion. So be really careful of nitrogen applications in that context. Do we have any questions on that?
Yes, so we, and it might not necessarily be on the soil fertility, but there are two questions came in. The first is going back to when you were talking about the fungi, depending on how you want to say it, which cover crops, which cover crops support the mycorrhizal, I didn't say that right either, fungi.
Mycorrhizal fungi, yes, you did. We're amongst friends here. So there's some very specific ones, and in general, it's the legume family, and in particular, it's the clovers. So red clover, which I used to grow historically on my farm for a cover crop, is wonderful for doing that. But there's some annual clovers too, and one that we recommend is berseem clover. And the reason we recommend the berseem over the red clover is it's an annual and it will die. The red clover is a short-lived perennial, and so you have to be able to manage that. And I will talk about that when we get to that point. So we're almost to the point for the questions we'll address in a minute. So here's a fun fact that I just learned this. And this is why I'm so careful about recommending fertilizer, and in particular phosphorus. 1 pound of phosphorus under the right conditions, if it gets into surface water, could be responsible for 300 to 500 pounds of algal growth. So on my farm, I took this picture hoping to be able to give this talk sometime. So here it is. So this is a commonly blended complete fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and a little bit of sulfur. So in the amount of material there, there's a pound, the equivalent of a pound of phosphorus. That's not a lot. I used 18 tons on my farm last year. I was really careful with it. And I handle it in bulk, and I put a tarp down underneath it so I could pick it up so it wouldn't end up on my driveway and into the surface water. This is why everyone's so uptight about phosphorus. And it's because of this, this fun fact here. you will see people are saying that you need that, or that it gives you 500 pounds. It's probably under normal conditions 400 pounds, but still, that's a lot. So we need to be really careful with phosphorus and also with soil erosion, soil leaving whatever ground it is we're managing, because that soil has the phosphorus bound to it. So this I actually took. I didn't pluck this off the internet. The world is full of funny stuff. You just got to look for it and hope you got a camera phone so you can capture it. That's on the Wisconsin River. I will stop here and take any other questions that may have come in.
There's one more. Do the type of weeds that occur indicate the health of the soil at all? So are there weeds that might thrive in acidic soil or occur in alkaline soil?
Well, so there's farmer wisdom that say yes, but it doesn't have to do with pH. I will have to think about that while I'm talking in the next section to see if I can come up with some examples. But in the case of nutrients, and in particular nitrogen, there are indicator species. So the pigweed family and the lamb's quarter family, if you have problems with those weeds that are outside of glyphosate resistance, then that will tell you that you're probably over applying nitrogen. So that's something to think about.
Okay. And then one more just came in, and you guys are going to trip me all up with this pronunciation. You know I'm not a gardener. Okay. What is a good source of potash?
Potash.
Potash? Okay.
Yes. So potash is a potassium containing material. It depends if you're organic or not. If you're not organic, if you go to, and not organic does not mean inorganic. If you're not organic, if you go to the garden center, you will find it's probably going to be potash. So potash is a salt, it's potassium chloride. So that's going to be in most commercial blends that you find out there. If you're organic, you want to look for potassium sulfate. That also is a mined material. They both come from roughly the same distance, travel distance to get to southeast Wisconsin. The price difference, it's almost double for the potassium sulfate. You are getting, well, in both cases, potassium sulfate or potash, you're getting total plant available or essential plant nutrients, because plants do need the chloride. They also need the sulfate. They need more sulfate than they do the chloride, but you're going to pay more for the potassium sulfate. In either case, what your plants don't take up, sulfate form or chloride form, what your plants don't take up, it's going to be lost to leaching, because both are negatively charged. So the soil can't hold on to them with the exchange sites, and they're both very soluble chemically, so they will leave the system. So here's a little fun fact that we don't have time, but I got to address it. So we use sodium chloride for road salt in the state of Wisconsin. In my town, the town of Troy, they just went totally away from sand or sand salt mixes. We use exclusively road salt, and the DNR and other groups are worried about the buildup of the chloride in our surface water. So that's another way the chloride gets into the surface water, is runoff from our roads. If you're using salt to melt ice at home, do it judiciously, please, so we don't end up with chloride in the surface water. So I don't know I just know it's bad for aquatic organisms. I don't know what the particular problem is, but that's something that the DNR is really concerned about. So think about that management for your grounds. All right, with that, I'm moving on. So I said it was a three-legged stool. I've got 5 legs here, but as you're going to see, they're all going to merge together and magically they're going to become 3. So we want to minimize tillage because tillage destroys the soil structure, and in doing so destroys the habitat where soil microbes live. You destroy their habitat, you destroy the biological activity. Number 2, keep the soil surface covered. So we do this with mulches or with cover crops. The reason we're doing that, covering the soil, is to prevent the raindrop impact from crusting the soil, which reduces infiltration of moisture, which our plants need, but also prevents gas exchange. And the other magic thing is that it reduces temperature fluctuations. So soils evolved over time to be highly buffered systems. They really want to resist extremes in moisture and in temperature. The microbes that live there, the roots, they want to avoid those extremes. So by keeping it covered, we're going to keep it a buffered system. We want to manage traffic because traffic compacts soil, but you got to work your garden, so you're going to compact it somewhat. So we'll talk about that later on. Add organic matter to stimulate the biological activity, and then use cover crops to both cover the surface to prevent the problem with the raindrop impact, and also to add organic matter and stimulate the mycorrhizal fungi, which get destroyed by the tillage. All right, so why till soil? Do we have to till soil? The answer is no. I've been no-tilling on my farm for almost 20 years now, and I can grow crops. Historically, the reason we've done it is to modify the soil physical condition, to break up compactive, massive soil. I will show you massive soil in just a minute, to break up crust, and for seedbed preparation. This definitely, we do need to do tillage here. No-till farmers do it with their planting equipment. We do it with the rototiller. What seedbed preparation is just a reduction in size of the aggregates that are there. We want to break them down so they're roughly the size of the seed that we're planting, and that helps the seed draw water from the soil solution around it for imbibition. Joanna, say that one 3 times really fast. That's the no. So imbibition is taking up the moisture so that it can initiate germination. So that's the first step in germination. The second is to bury crop residue and organic matter. So from a farmer standpoint, that's just so we can get our equipment through it. Most modern farming equipment can now deal with residue, but in the past that was a huge problem. And part of the reason I went to no-till, I just couldn't deal with corn stalks. My equipment couldn't deal with it, and I got tired of unplugging my equipment, stopping to unplug it. The other is for disease management. So if we got a healthy soil, we incorporate that residue, the bacteria break it down. Suddenly the pathogens don't have a place to hang out, and they perish in this warfare, this germ warfare that is a healthy soil. And then nutrient cycling. So we've got the nutrients tied up in organic forms in the plant tissue. The soil microbes, they release those nutrients in plant available form, and the next crop can then take it up. And then lastly, controlling weeds. So back in the day, that was cultivation in our gardens. It's with hoeing. So we still use tillage. I still hoe in my garden to control weeds. So here's some pictures from my farm. This is last summer. So on the right, this is the soil surface. At face value, it appears to be really massive. So it's just one big glob of soil. I go through with my planter shown here, and the planting process is behind it. These are the rows. This is a row right here. I've done minimal soil disturbance, and really what it is fracturing of what's there. And you look at how well aggregated the soil is. That's from a combination of cover crops and not having tillage. And all I did was free the aggregates that were already there. So even in what appears to be massive soil, the aggregates are there. The soil needs to be teased a little bit to free them. So here's the negative aspects of tillage. You reduce your organic matter content. The reason is we put a flush of oxygen in there. Any undecomposed organic matter that's there, or even the more stable organic matter, if there's available nutrients, the soil bugs will chew on that carbon skeleton to get the energy. And so that's going to reduce the organic matter content. And we have an overwhelming body of evidence that shows what's happened to organic matter in soils over time. So, and I just saw a graph of this. I should have put this in. So now I'm gonna show you a graph. So this is, well, this is right, because this is how you're looking at it. Here's the other problem, talking to a computer screen. So this is the y-axis over here. So this is percent organic matter. And then down here on the Joanna Jim interface, that's the x-axis, and that's with time. So time is heading in this direction. So over time, we start out, I got to look at my camera, not my smiling face. So we start out here with a line. Here's a line. So this is pre-human activity. So organic matter was in steady state. We started doing tillage, and what happened? This is some high tech graphics. Our organic matter levels plunged. And now they're at a steady state here. So we have a new equilibrium. Well, so what we found over time, if you keep doing tillage, you stay at that new equilibrium. Start cover cropping, cut the tillage with no till, all of a sudden the line starts going up. But we never get back to here. We plateau somewhere here. I can't wait to tell my daughter I did this. So we never get back to where we were, but we can improve it. So the point is, we're trying to manage it to get back to where we were in native states. So tillage, it may impact structure depending on what you're doing. If you're breaking down aggregates on the surface, you've got smaller particles there. The raindrops are going to solubilize those aggregates. The clay is going to plug the pores, and so you're going to get crusting. Then you get a rain, you're going to increase runoff. With the tillage operation itself, every time you do a tillage pass, the rule of thumb is you lose a ½ inch equivalent of rainfall to evaporation, and you're going to reduce biological activity. So those are definitely negative aspects of tillage. As a no-till farmer, I'll also tell you, it brings up rocks. I don't have to pick rocks anymore. Once I quit that habit, a couple of years throwing rocks in the bucket, I was done. Is tillage necessary? So ask yourself the question and think about the trade-off between your objective, seedbed preparation, controlling weeds, and breaking up massive structure in the soil. Is the loss of structure, because each operation is going to jeopardize aggregates, and the extent of the damage depends on how stable the aggregates are, and then the loss of organic matter. So here's tips to avoid physical problems. Stay off of wet soil. Wet soil compacts very easily. This gets back to that graph. There's a magic point at the top of that graph where it really compacts easy, and that's where you get maximum compaction. Don't work the soil wet. It should crumble freely in your hand. I demonstrated that before. And don't use excessive tillage. If you do major tillage, like to incorporate organic matter, that I'm going to talk about in a minute, do it in the fall. That's when the freeze-thaw cycle, if you do some compaction, that will break up any clod formation or massive compaction that you form if you get frost, and use the rototiller judiciously. Don't do it in the fall. I'm going to show you a picture why. Just use it for seedbed preparation. I have a tiller. I use it for seedbed preparation. That's it. The rest of it I do with other equipment. Here is soil from the Rock County Community Garden, vegetable garden. They removed all the crop residue. You see, it's a massive soil condition. Next to it here's someone that used the rototiller in the fall. What they do, they reduce it to dust. You can see, excuse me, you can see a few little aggregates, but mostly they just pulverize it to dust. What's going to happen in this situation? Snowpack over winter, all that weight, they're going to have massive condition when they come back in the spring. They totally shot themselves in the foot. This gardener used the spade, so they just broke up that massive condition a little bit. You see there's all these little aggregates in here. There's some larger clods that are a bunch of aggregates that are kind of pushed together. A little light working, like with the garden rake, that'll free those aggregates up. Perfect soil, maybe one pass with the rototiller for to free those aggregates. Seedbed preparation, yeah, away you go. In summary, perform, and this is management steps, perform major tillage in the fall. This includes the mixing of amendments and lime if you're correcting for soil pH. The reason you have to mix the lime with the soil is it's a very localized chemical reaction, so it has to be mixed. The freeze-thaw cycles, like I said, will help reform aggregates if you broke it down too much into dust, or if you form clods, it'll help if you have the freeze-thaw, help break up the clods. I prefer the use of a spade or a fork. Put the rototiller away at the end of July. Don't use it for fall tillage. In the spring, use it for seedbed preparation only, and then repair any damage that you're going to cause. And it's a fact of life. Tillage is going to cause some kind of damage. Repair it with the best management practices. So adding organic matter and cover cropping. Cover and traffic, we're going to cover these together. Keep the soil covered, but remember, you have to remove your vegetable residue for sanitation. So add back mulch. I'm going to show you a picture. You all know what mulch looks like. Use cover crops to keep that soil surface covered where you don't have crops growing. And then think about your planting density and the architecture of the crops that you're growing. I like Swiss chard. I like kale. I like to eat them, but I also like them because they spread out and they protect the soil that's not covered immediately by their stalks moving up. They tend to spread out, so it's a spreading growth habit. There's a lot of other crops. Zucchini are the same thing. I mulch my zucchini once they come out of the ground, and so they will grow out over that. The other reason I mulch the zucchini is I can walk on that soil when it's a lot wetter, because it physically supports my weight over that wet soil beneath it. So think about your row spacings. Get the rows closer together if you can, but weigh that against spreading species like the Swiss chard and the kale and that kind of thing. Also, minimize traffic. So here's a fun fact. Most compaction occurs with the first pass. So I said most. I didn't commit this to writing. I remember in my aging brain, 50 to 70% is the first pass. So that's why the recommendation for farmers is to control wheel traffic, establish your pass, your wheel tracks, and stay in them. Same thing with the footpath. So establish your footpath or use raised beds. That's where your traffic's going to be, but confine your traffic to the footpaths. Don't go where your plants are going to grow. Stay off the paths when they're wet, but you got to harvest, right? Tomatoes, when they ripen, you get a week of rainy weather, you're going to go out and you're going to pick your tomatoes. So think about mulching paths. I did that last year. Anything where I had to get out where I had to harvest when it was going to be wet, I mulched right over the top of the path. And you'll see a picture of that in a minute. You're going to see it right now. So here's my garden back on Memorial Day weekend. So I got all my farm work done. The tractors parked in the shed. I got all my seed in the ground. You can see all my footpaths there. You can see between them. I will never step foot on that soil again. Here's my vine crops. So the squashes, the watermelons, all my transplants. There's a lot of space in between that they're going to grow into, but they're not to that point yet. I also am going to put my tomatoes in here. You're going to see in the next picture, hey, I did that. There's all my mulch there. Here's my sweet corn. This is around the 4th of July. The vine crops are coming on. Not as much as I would have thought. We had great growing conditions, a lot of heat, a lot of sunshine. but water, moisture was the limiting factor. So you can see I watered here. So what did I do? In between where that soil is bare and subject to raindrop impact, I planted buckwheat cover crop. Here's what it looked like. I should have taken a picture. I know I took a picture when it was blossoming. So I let it blossom. So I had pollinator habitat, hey, annual pollinator habitat. And then I mowed it down with my push mower. This is one of the cover crops that we recommend because even though it grows up and it looks like there's a lot of biomass there, there's not a lot of biomass. There's a lot of tissue, but it's mostly moisture. And so with the push mower, I was able to mow it, kept the weeds down. I had active growing roots in there to stimulate the biological activity. I protected the surface to prevent crusting. And it was a beautiful system. I'm doing it again this year. I have a plot seeder because I'm a scientist. But you can do the same thing with a garden rake. And so just broadcast the seed out there. I, in fact, went out with a garden rake and raked after, actually I raked before I went through with the plot seeder. Anyway, it's something you can do in the home garden, no problem. All right, organic amendments. Bearing in mind I have 2 minutes left, but you're all going to stick around class a little bit late because you're sitting in the comfort of your own home. So organic amendments have physical and chemical impacts on the soil. Their impact are immediate in the case of the physical impacts, or they're long-term because of chemical. The immediate is they will act as a soil bulking agent, and I'm thinking about the case of compost. So you think about a nice crumbly compost, it looks a lot like a nice, well aggregated soil. So you're going to get it in there where you have problems with your soil aggregation, and it's going to create the pore space for the gas exchange, for ease of root penetration, and for infiltration and drainage of excess water. They're also going to act as a nutrient source because there's going to be a lot of plant nutrients that are still available. And they did break down in the compost pile, but those nutrients that are there, they didn't go anywhere. They probably didn't leach out unless your soil was heavily weathered. So it's going to be available to the next generation of crops. Here's the thing to remember. The majority of material that you add, and this includes some compost, is going to decompose in the first year. That's okay, because in doing so, the plant bacteria, the fungi, took that material and they glued the mineral materials together. But what this means is that you need to add these on an annual basis. So it's something you have to do on a regular basis. So materials, we have a lot of materials available to us. I prefer the compost, and the reason is that if you have proper compost that's heated, you will have killed weed seeds, and you don't have to worry about pathogens or other, well, it's primarily pathogens that we worry about, and in particular with manure, fecal coliform bacteria that can get us sick because they will have been killed in the composting process. If you're going to use manure, please compost it. If you don't, apply it in the fall of the year beforehand to allow the free-for-all that is the soil to take care of any fecal coliform bacteria that get into soil, because they cannot survive well in soil. Crop residue, we can also use that as an organic form. If you can't, organic source, if you can incorporate it directly into your soil, then run it through the compost pile. Process waste, I include in here leaves that you might get from your local municipality, which are probably being composted anyway, or cover crops, a great way to add organic matter, and especially fresh organic matter. They have different roles and uses. The compost and the manure that you're adding, that's more as a nutrient source that you may be bringing nutrients in. The cover crops are going to cycle nutrients that are there, but are going to have fresh, readily available carbon for the soil bacteria, and later on the soil fungi that are already in the soil. So a different functionality. compost. So this is more field scale compost, or what it would look like if you got it from your municipal compost yard. So here's a picture, and I don't know where this picture came from because I took it off the internet. So you can kind of see that this compost is not ready to go because you can identify individual plant parts that are already in it. And if you can do that, then it's not ready to go. This shows a mature compost, and there's a little bit of plant material like straw-like particles in here, but you can see the aggregation in here that you can't really see here. Here you got clumps of kind of slimy plant material that haven't fully broken down. Here it's fully broken down, and this more resembles the soil physical properties of a well aggregated soil. So here you're going to get the nutrients, but also the physical bulking properties of the compost. Using compost, amend over a site, never amend a hole. So this hole goes back to the idea of transplants. So like trees, recommendations, even from extension, used to say 30 years ago, hey, you pour a bunch of compost in that site when you're transplanting. Don't do that. You create a comfort zone, and the plant roots for that very expensive trophy ornamental you bought are not going to want to leave that comfort zone. And so they're going to end up, they'll go to the edge, they'll hit the compacted soil, and it's like, hey, this is mineral soil. We want back in the organic. So they'll start growing back, and then pretty soon, you can't really do this well in a live talk and get the full impact. Pretty soon they're all growing around one another. They become root bound, and they're going to go into slow decay. And that slow decay takes a while. Slow decay, slow decline. That decline takes a while. If you bought really fancy ornamentals, you probably got a warranty on them, a couple of years. Well, this all shows up after the warranty's done. So you're out of luck on that one. So as far as a recommendation, incorporate by volume, 25 to 50% by volume. You will see rate recommendations out there. That rate depends on a whole lot of factors. So the rates are like 4 bushels per 100 square feet. I prefer to go by volume. I think by going on a rate, you under apply, but this depends also on how much material you have. If you have a lot of it, use a lot of it. You're not really going to run into trouble. You could potentially run into some nutrient problems with micronutrients, but I doubt you're going to get to that case. But if you start seeing wacky discoloration, like interveinal discolorations, so between the veins and the leaves, you start seeing different colors, like a kind of a rhododendron, then maybe you're getting into trouble with micronutrients, but I kind of doubt that's going to be the case. Work to a depth of 6 to 12 inches. It's going to be hard to work it in deeper than that. Most of the activity with horticultural plants is in the top 6 inches of soil, so you really don't have to get too deep beyond that. But mixing with the soil is important, especially if you're going to use it for a bulking agent. If you make surface application, make sure that you incorporate it. If you don't, it's going to slow warming and drying in most springs. A spring like we're having this year, hey, no problem. But think back, well, last year wouldn't have been a problem either. But think back 2018, 2019, when it was really wet. I mean, that's just going to slow things down. Last point, if you're getting municipal compost, age it for a year. And I think I've said this to your group before. If you're using municipal compost, get this year's compost last year. The reason for doing that is because grass clippings get included in that, and a lot of the common herbicides that get used on lawns, 2,4-D and dicamba, MCPA, those kind of compounds, they take a while to break down. They have a 6-month half-life, at least 2,4-D does. So half the material is gone in 6 months, but then it takes another 6 months for the next quarter to disappear. So there's always going to be some material there. And the materials that we use for broadleaves and leaves are, even in low quantities, are tomatoes, are eggplants, all the really fun things that we grow in our garden, really sensitive, and just little trace amounts can cause damage. So that's why I make this recommendation. Best practice, I've already said this, apply compost periodically. If you're using it for nutrient, then base it on nutrient removal by your crops, but that's more for commercial applications where you're pushing it and you probably can't meet nutrient requirements with just compost. You're going to have to use commercial fertilizer, and compost your plant residues if disease is of concern to you. So you're going to see a picture in a minute of my garden. I use a moldboard plow. That's the only tillage I do on my farm is in my garden, and I use the tool of the devil, the moldboard plow. I like it because it totally inverts the soil and gets rid of the residue on the surface. And my soil, I'd like to think, is really active because of the cover cropping I do on it and the organic matter that I do add to it in the form of manure. So I'd like to think that I'm not going to have a disease problem. And I'd know it because I'd see it. And then use cover crops whenever possible in a rotation. So the thing about the cover crop residues is they're really young, fresh material. The way I look at compost from a soil activity standpoint, that's like going to a restaurant and ordering tofu. That's great. Would you rather order tofu? And no offense to the vegetarians in the group, but the cover crops are like the ribeye steak. I mean, that stuff is tasty, available stuff, and the microbes are going to jump on that. So the fresh addition to the cover crop tissue is going to stimulate the biological activities. Legumes, because they fix atmospheric nitrogen for supplemental nitrogen. The forage legumes, like we talked about before, for the mycorrhizal fungi. So in particular, the clovers, and in particular the Berseem clover, because it will winter kill. Watch for pest interactions. When I talk about cover crops, I'll tell you, we vetted the cover crop species. There are very few problems with pests with the ones that we've selected. And then consider the biotillage benefits. So cover crops that have taproot that'll grow deep, it'll grow through the compacted zone here into the deeper root zone. I went outside on my camera range. Compost summary, surface applied materials will slow it, so you got to incorporate it. Sanitation, we talked about that. Manure, compost, or apply in the fall of the year. Fall applied manure applications are okay if incorporated, because the fecal coliform bacteria will be deceased by the time you can buy your crops will be taking it up. All right, cover crops, as the name implies, this is kind of a catch-all, but cover crop, the name implies it covers the soil surface. It protects the soil surface when no crops are present. It'll add organic matter. Root action will improve soil physical properties. They will stimulate biological activities because the tissues tend to be a lot younger physiologically than the crop residues that we're adding. And so it's going to stimulate biological diversity and abundance. So there's going to be, when they get incorporated, their tissues, or even if you terminate them or they just die with frost, all that green root material from the younger plants, the stuff that's already in the soil, you can leave the residue on the surface to protect the surface, but all that stuff that's below the surface, those roots, young, tender tissue, soil bacteria are just going to have a heyday with them. So the publication from the Learning Star, cover crops for the home garden, 5 species in there. There's a selection matrix to select the species based on when you're planting it, warm season versus cool season, and what you want to do. Do you want to fix nitrogen, to add nitrogen to the system? Do you want to add carbon? Based on your timing and your goal, there's a decision tree in there that'll help you come to the desired species for planting. I did say pest interactions, and the one in the middle here, buckwheat, here it is in flower. This will attract pollinators, and they're beautiful. And in particular, honeybees will forage on it. This can be an attractant for Japanese beetles. If you've already been through the high population, so those of you that have had them know they come in and their populations follow a curve. They will explode with time and then they decline. And we don't really know why they decline. I'd like to think a lot of them moved on to areas where they don't have competition from others. There may be natural pests. Pests may get used to it. It's just biology in action. So they decline with time. But this is one that'll definitely attract them. So if you're early, you don't have them, don't worry about it. If they're late to the game, you can plant them, and then you won't have huge populations. You can pick them off and drop them in the pail of warm soapy water. So here's my garden this year. I did the moldboard plow. I incorporated all my residues. I threw my wood ash, my wood burner out there. Here it was. I couldn't stand it. This was last week. So Friday, I went out and I did tillage. So I showed you my garden before. I got a lot of trial work I got to do. I don't really plant my garden except for sweet corn until Memorial Day weekend. So I looked at the calendar. I got 60 days of that sitting there doing nothing. I couldn't have anything to do. I didn't want anything to do with that. So I broadcast cover crop seed, 2 species that are going to be really active growing, one tap rooted, one fibrous rooted. I broadcasted the seed. I incorporated it. Come back in a week. Well, we don't have a talk next week. I'd like to, because this has been a whole lot of fun. Let me tell you, folks. So that'll be green, actively growing. I am stimulating the soil biology, but more importantly, I am protecting the surface from crusting. So I'm not going to have to do much tillage to put my stuff in there for my transplants. Nothing light raking, or I guess I'm going to have to rototill to take care of the cover crop biomass. But anyway, I will protect my soil, and I've got something actively growing. Remember, with cover crops, you need to manage it. So I mentioned the rainy years. I didn't have a garden in 2008 or 2009, so I planted a cover crop, a warm season species, to add soil carbon. This is sorghum Sudan grass. Also, it's got millet in it, some other taller growing species. This is, I forget, it's 30 or 45 days after planting. This is a yardstick. This stuff will grow up to 6 foot tall, then it'll flower. I have the ability to mow mechanically. So I let it grow till it flowered. I mowed it. I mowed it just before flower, and it regrew, and I did the same thing. These ones also, the sorghum Sudan in particular, is anti-nematode. It's got nemacidal properties. So I'm taking advantage of that natural characteristic of the biology to suppress any nematodes that I may have in my garden. This is where my sweet corn's going in next year. It's corn on corn. That's unfortunate, but that's because the wet weather 2 years ago messed up my rotation. So I planted winter rye in there for cover crop. That's to jumpstart the biology. I've got enough soil cover. I don't need to keep my soil covered, but that was to jumpstart the biology. So I'm going to terminate that stuff, but I can do that in a no-till system chemically and giddy up. The other reason I planted it, and I actually scoffed at this from a conservation standpoint in an agricultural setting, it's like, why would you put a cover crop in after a crop that produces all the residue we could possibly need? I mean, you see very little bare soil. This stuff, at 40 pounds to the acre, it's actively growing, so it's stimulating the biology, but it's also sucking up any residual nitrogen in the form of nitrate, which could end up in the groundwater, and it's going to be back in my system, back up here in the topsoil, not down. Joanna, just for fun, go like this. Not down there in the subsoil where there aren't a lot of roots, but now its roots are down there sucking that up, so it's not going to go into the groundwater. All right, what about gypsum? This always comes up. Can we use gypsum to break up compacted heavy clay soils? So we always said that, yeah, it'll break up compaction, but chemical compaction. Chemical compaction happens out west where they use irrigation water that has a lot of sodium in it. So the irrigation water brings the sodium up to the surface, dumps it on the surface, and it flocculates the soil. So it causes a chemical dispersion in effect. So we thought we couldn't use it. We had a lot of it around. I mean, there's naturally occurring mineral. So my material, like I've got in the picture there, but we also get it from power plant scrubbers. Well, so people were dumping on just tons per acre, and Big Gypsum was saying, yeah, we could use this for soil health. The scientific research up till this point, the literature says, yeah, we do maybe see an effect, but maybe not. This is not for chemical compaction, but for physical compaction on clay soils. The research literature, in my professional opinion, is saying yes. We have a lot of positive industry claims, but they are conveniently selling the product at a rate that over applies it and is creating potentially problems with sulfur leaching into groundwater. To this point, it hasn't been supported by research. We are losing gypsum, our supply from the scrubbers, because the coal plants are all shutting down. That's bad if you're a railroad who banked on hauling coal to the power plants. It's good if you're thinking about greenhouse gas emission. I actually just got funded to do a study where we're banning it in row for this very purpose, breaking up physical compaction to prevent crusting. There's enough evidence in the literature to suggest that, yeah, maybe it does work on physical compaction. My colleague, Dr. Francisco I can't pronounce his last name, starts with an A, UW Extension soil scientist, he's saying, yeah, it's pointing that way too. So if you're thinking about it for your clay soils, it can't hurt. And guess what? You get calcium with it, and calcium is a plant nutrient. So I'm less dubious than the last time we talked. What about mycorrhizal inoculants? So we talked about the problem with the tillage and the mycorrhizal association. That's a highly valuable symbiosis. So if we're hurting them with the tillage, how about inoculating our soil? Here too, there's a lot of testimonials. I think for high value, for garden crops, I'm not sure of. For high value ornamentals, I think maybe, because they're the cost benefit value or ratio, I think that it would pay to do it. The regenerative farmers that I work with, they're saying, no, don't do it. For a while there, they were all brewing up their own seed treatments to put on their seed. And now they're, after trial and tribulation, they're all saying, no, let's not till the soil. Let's have natural mycorrhizal spores out there. This one's mixed. Think about it when you look at the bag, the price on the bag, and how much tillage you're actually doing. I wish we had those multiple cases of beer and had discussion time now, because it is time for the questions. I'm ready for the grilling. And this is one I'm sure is going to generate a lot of discussion. We have a lot in the chat box. Joanna, work your magic.
I don't even know what that is a picture of, but that's pretty fantastic. All right.
It's a DIY grill.
It sure is.
If we were in Rock County, where Pork Fest, which draws 6,000 people to the fairgrounds for the pork producers pork cookout, I would joke and say, this is the first Pork Fest.
Well, I'm just impressed that this person has a shopping cart, yet not a grill. So
they probably got the shopping cart. They probably got their grade from offsite.
All right. Okay, so here is the first question, which I can pronounce, but I've never heard of. Okay. Is lasagna gardening or lasagna soil prep a good idea to improve soil?
Okay, so it's not Lent, I'm Catholic, but I still feel the need to confess I've never done it. If I haven't done it, I don't talk about it, but I listened to Larry Mueller on Garden Talk, highly recommended. They have experts that come in and talk about it. They say they will never go back. So for those of you that don't know what we're talking about, lasagna gardening is where you layer things, and it's done basically to solve a lot, well, it's a lot less work than traditional gardening, tilling the soil, but it's also done to get away from a lot of soil physical properties. You have high clay content, you have poor drainage, you have crusting, you might have weeds. Everyone's got weeds in their garden. So you put down a layer of cardboard. So that's the barrier for the weeds that are there. If it's a perennial weed, it's going to kill the perennials like quackgrass or thistles, Canada thistle. It will kill them. Then you put on top, some people say newsprint, some people don't, compost, leaves. You build it up in layers like lasagna. And then whatever's at the top, you might put soil in there, you might not. You put compost, you plant into there. Basically, that's all the components of soil except for the mineral material, but you're mimicking the soil physical property of a good soil, a highly functional soil, and people swear by it. And Larry Mueller has guests on his show that talk about it and the steps. And you can go back to the archives on his show to get there, to go back to the archives, and this topic is covered. So people do it, they have success. It makes a lot of sense to me. Never done it because I have a moldboard below.
Okay, excellent. Next question comes from Carolyn and Mike. So they love your idea about the buckwheat clover crop, cover crop between the rows. And so they want to try it this year. So their question is, the following spring, do you rotate your crops so you're growing them where you had the buckwheat the previous year? Or, and if so, how do you incorporate that cover crop into the soil to prepare that?
So I should have taken a fall picture of this. So what happened was the vine crops spread out over the top of it. So you can see they're starting to vine right now. They're starting to creep out. So that was the idea there. And I thought, okay, I'm going to wait. So buckwheat's an annual. I'm going to wait the last mowing until it flowers. Once an annual flowers, you can mow it, and the textbook says you will kill it. Doesn't always happen, but most of the time it happens. So I ended up killing it. So this is right after I mowed it, and I still had the goo all over my boots. And it's messy, I will tell you. And the residue tends to clump up. Well, in fact, look right here. You can see a big wad of green, fresh green material there. But what happened was it died out, and then this totally covered it out. So I'm going to rotate this section of garden. I'm not going to have vine crops here, and that's for disease prevention. So in addition to destroying the residue, we also just want to rotate in case the pathogens can overwinter. So I will have, this year, I will have my vine crops down here. So I'm going to do the same thing here. So my tomatoes and everything are going to be up here. So I'm rotating for disease.
Will you plant though where you had the cover crops this year?
Yeah, but it'll be totally different.
But it'll be totally different crops.
But that residue totally disappeared within a couple of weeks of this mowing under the canopy of the vine crops, just because it's really young succulent tissue, and so it breaks down right away.
Okay, excellent. And then a question from Deborah about compost application. She says, I hear you say 6 inches on the surface worked into the top 6 inches of soil.
Right. So if you go deeper, you're going to get, so most of the action in horticultural crops and agronomic crops, for that matter, from a nutrient standpoint, is in the top 6 inches of soil. So I learned that I proved that in the 5 years of my graduate studies, taking soil samples to a depth of 3 feet, which takes a lot of work when you do it by hand. All the nutrient activity is in the top 6 inches. So if you're thinking about nutrients, confine your nutrients there. The physical benefits do go further down. And that's not to say that that top 6 inches is the extent of the rooting depth. Plants will root a lot deeper than that, and that's for moisture, to bring moisture up when the topsoil dries out. So if you can get your compost worked in deeper, by all means do it, because it'll act as a sponge when the ground starts to dry out in summertime. But from a practical standpoint, mixing it that deep, unless you got the mower plow like I do, you're not gonna be able to get it that deep.
And then Deb from the Permaculture and Gardening Group pointed out that we have a composting lasagna garden tour event on April 17th for anyone who might be interested in that lasagna gardening to see it in action there. So that I will send out the link to that registration when I send out the information with this video. So, and then Christine says to cut the buckwheat before the seeds form, it makes a nice friable soil.
A friable soil, right. So this gets to the rooting nature of the cover crop. So buckwheat has very fine. So I'm inviting myself back just to talk about cover crops for next time. I got all sorts of pictures of the different roots. It has a very, very fine root system. So there's a rural myth out there that buckwheat roots really deeply and it'll exude an acid into the soil to make phosphorus available, and it'll draw that phosphorus from deep in the subsoil up. No, it doesn't. It may have a few roots that go deeper, but most of the roots are about yay long, and they're really confined in that top area, and that area is just full of roots, and they will break that soil up. So if you got a tight upper layer, beautiful crop for doing that. Oats, any of the grass species are also really good at doing that. Annual ryegrass, I'm hesitant to bring that one up, but it does the same thing. The reason I'm hesitant to bring that one up is it can be difficult to control. With tillage, it's not so much an issue, but if you're relying on chemical control, forget it, because it's Roundup resistant, or at least tolerant.
Excellent. And Deborah did stick the link to the composting event in the chat. And if people are interested in that, that's limited to 12 participants because it's in person. So I would register quickly. And then let's see, very timely, Debbie asks, do we offer a webinar on using cover crops? So it seems like it's just destined for us to do this again, talk cover crops. So, and I think we've done one on cover crops fairly recently, but I think doing another would be fantastic. So from Connie, she wants to know, is goat manure okay to apply in spring?
Goat manure, well, yes and no. So the other issue with spring application of fresh manure is the nitrogen in it. So manure, when it's decomposing, will release ammonia gas, and that can burn really tender tissue, like in transplants. So that's another reason to be concerned about the fresh manure addition. If it's incorporated well before plants are going to use it, the burn issue probably isn't there. But again, it gets back to the fecal coliform issue. and it scares me. So in certified organic production, they have definite requirements about when it can be applied prior to harvest of the crop. And then there's also the issue of, will the harvested portion come in contact with soil or not? So that's something to think about. The other thing that concerns me a little bit was I read an article about, and I think I've talked about this with the group, about the ability of fecal pathogens, coliform pathogens, including E. coli, to be able to break the root barrier through some kind of wound and be translocated to the fruiting body. So what I'm thinking about is a tomato. So if you have a coliform in the soil, the plant could translate it to the tomato. So that's built-in food poisoning. And Dr. Jerry Barak in the plant pathology department of UW-Madison was looking at this. And I haven't been on our website for a couple of years, so since I haven't been working in the organic realm, so I haven't really followed that. But that's a concern.
All right, and then we have a question from Anne about onions. So she's letting an area rest this year because she planted onions 2 years in a row, and then they were very small the second year. So she's letting that area rest. So she's wondering, should she add compost or plant the is it Berseem clover?
All of the above. So the small onions get into what we call the rotation effect, and crops just in general do not do as well the second year, which is one of the reasons why we rotate crops. And there's all sorts of reasons, diseases, there's a whole lot of it. The rotation effect is probably the most studied thing in agriculture. We still don't know what causes it. So rotating crops is really important. And what this really tells me is this is a fallow situation. So if you're not going to grow any other kind of garden crop, the fallow situation is the perfect time to take care of all of the damage that's been created just by the very nature of gardening. So tillage, traffic, what have you. So add the compost, yes, and then grow a cover crop on top of it. And if you're taking the whole season out of production, then I would grow several different types of cover crops to get the management or to get the magic of the individual species attributes. So I would grow an early season cover just to keep the weeds down. I would terminate that, and it may have to be with tillage, but if it flowers, like in the case of Berseem, so Berseem would help with the mycorrhizal fungi. It's going to flower. Once it flowers, you cut it, it's dead. You could plant a warm season species like sorghum Sudan and produce a lot of biomass, suppress the nematodes. The problem is with that biomass, you have to be able to control that too. So if it flowers, if you could cut it down, it'll break down. If you could mow it mechanically and chop that material up, like I have the ability to do, that's another winner. And then plant a cool season species after that. So something like oats or something else that are winter kill. So you got all this cover crop magic. You've mixed the species up temporally over time. And so you've gotten all of their attributes and you've left the soil undisturbed, because most of these species, the other thing to say is they are not fastidious like a lot of our garden crops. They don't need really good soil seed contact. So if you broadcast that seed into the mold residue, you're probably going to get a really good stand, especially if you water them if it gets dry to get them going. They don't need the soil seed contact. So that's a beautiful fallow system in my mind. The other thing that I haven't talked about, so I talked about temporal diversity. So that's one species following, sorry, I got to talk in the air if I'm going to talk with my hands. One species following another one. What if you mix them to get the attributes? So there are several different mixes that work well together where you can mix up the architecture of the roots along with any magical pest interactions they may have. A real common warm season mix is cowpeas with the sorghum sudan or the millet. And some people and the farmers are doing this, and it baffled me at first, but it makes sense. They actually even put cool season like brassicas in there. So when the warm season species fizzle, and when I say fizzle, they slow down in their growth when the nights start getting cool, like in later August. When it frosts, you get the first frost that kills them. Then the cool seasons come on. So that's an example of a mix. Another good example of a mix, a cool season mix, is the oats with the forage radish, as I call it, tillage radish, which is a proprietary commercial name for an improved variety. So there you have the really thick taproot to do the biotillage down deep, and the fibrous root system up in the top layer, the Jim layer here, to break up tight topsoil. And that's the beautiful thing in the mix. The mixes work really well too to manage risk. So if you get growing conditions that favor one species over another, if you're in pure stand, if you're the loser, based on conditions, you're the loser on the cover crop. But if you have the mix, you just lose that component of the mix. So diversity, like all things, diversity is key, and it's important in cover cropping too. The reason we recommended the pure stands in the cover crop publication from UW Extension is to guarantee success, and we're assuming beginner level. So as you get a little more advanced, then you start playing around with mixes and more problematic species, or more difficult to manage, not problematic. So like this one here, the sorghum sudan, I can manage that. I have a big garden that's 120 by 30. So I can get into a farm scale equipment and manage that. In my sweet corn patch, which is also sometimes a production field, this is winter rye, which can be very difficult to control. So it doesn't look like much now, although I'm really happy with it for what it looks like, given how late I planted. I planted it in November. Come back in 2 weeks, it's going to be probably 4 inches tall. Around May 1st to May 15th, when I plan on terminating this, it's going to be knee high. Definitely not something you want in the garden, but I can control it with herbicide, which is my intent.
Well, Jim, thank you so much. I think this is probably a good place for us to stop tonight, but this has been incredibly educational, and we thank you so much for your generosity of your time and sticking around and giving us so much more time than we thought. All right, well, thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a great night. And Jim, thank you for a very fun and entertaining presentation.
Thank you all. Thanks for the invite to come back and talk about cover crops, although I invited myself. And thanks for indulging me. 42 minutes over time, that's the record.